This episode of CelloChat is brought to you by Carriage House Violins of Johnson String Instrument. Please visit us at www.carriagehouseviolins.com.
Great, and we are live.
Well, I want to invite everyone to strap on your time travel gear, fasten your seatbelts. We are going back to the year 1850. So you might wonder, why am I going to go back that far, and why am I going to talk about my particular family? All of you had families alive then. If you didn't have ancestors alive then, you wouldn't be here right now, so that case is closed. I'll give you the answer. I have not met anyone else in my particular lifetime who has ancestors going back 4 generations who were seriously involved in classical music, and sometimes at a very, very high level. And I thought, before the questions come in, it might be interesting for me to tell you my story and tell you about some of the people, the history, all of that kind of thing, just to entertain you with something unusual. So let me set the scene. 1850. Well, of course, Bach. Let me set the musical scene. Of course, Bach, Haydn, and Mozart are dead. Beethoven, Schumann, Schubert, Mendelssohn, and Chopin are also no longer alive. But we are in the heart of the Romantic period. And that's where my ancestors come in. That 100-year period, from 1800 to 1900, or maybe a little longer, is by any estimate one of the richest periods in music history. And this is where they come into the picture. So that's the musical setting. And we are in Russia, by the way. Now, let me tell you a little bit about families. So I'm a first-generation American. Part of my family came from Romania. The other part came from Russia. I'm the first member of my family born in this country. Now, we're not going to talk about the Romanian family, because the famous musicians actually came mostly from the Russian side, but I have to tell you a joke at my expense. My Romanian grandfather was a baker. My Russian grandfather was actually a very well-known violinist who was on the faculty of Curtis when it opened. And when I told this to one of my friends years ago when I was a student, he said, "Michael, that makes sense. A baker, a concert artist, you're a half-baked concert artist," which was, at the time, pretty good definition of where I was. I hope I've moved on since then. Anyway, now let's look at the families. And we're going to go all the way through to my lifetime. We're going to start in Moscow. Now, the names Nikolai and Anton Rubinstein might not be familiar to you, but they were 2 of the greatest pianists and musicians in Russia during this period, up to close to 1900. They were friends of Tchaikovsky's. In fact, Nikolai hired Tchaikovsky to teach harmony at the Moscow Conservatory. Nikolai they were both famous pianists. Anton is considered the founder of the Russian piano school. Now, what does this have to do with me? My great-grandmother, Olga Maurin, studied in Tchaikovsky's harmony class at the Moscow Conservatory. She took piano lessons from Nikolai. And her daughter, my grandmother, Vera Maurina, was supposed to go study with Anton. Well, in fact, she went on to study with a name you'll certainly know, Ferruccio Busoni, and Emil von Sauer, another famous pianist who you might not recognize, had a major career, had a trio. I'm going to talk about my grandfather and his brother in a moment. Had a trio called the Russian Trio that concertized all over Europe. In other words, my grandmother, my grandfather, and his brother. I have letters from the Kaiser, from all the royalty in Europe, the concerts that they played. And the thrill of thrills, I was reading Paul Klee's diary, the painter. In 1980, he heard a concert of theirs. He entered it in his diary. He said they were fabulous, and they played the Tchaikovsky piano trio. So my grandmother then, we're coming historically to a period of incredible turmoil. There's the First World War, and in Russia there's the revolution. So my grandmother actually ended up in the United States, finally, and one of her daughters was my mother. But another one of her daughters was the personal assistant to Pablo Casals. And then there's me. Now, let me go to the other line. Oh, I forgot to tell you, Olga Marina's family, they were members of the minor Russian nobility. So my grandmother undoubtedly grew up in very, very, very nice circumstances. Olga moved in the highest musical circles. My grandmother went to the Moscow Conservatory and won a gold medal. Okay, that's my grandmother. Now we're going to go to Vilna. It's Vilnius now, but Lithuania at that time was a part of the Russian Empire. This is a completely different story. My great-grandfather, Isaac Press, was the principal trumpet player of the Vilna Opera. He fell ill, and his son, my grandfather Michael, it's hard to believe, but it's true. He became the concertmaster of the Vilna Opera when he was 13. He supported his entire family, and then I don't know what this is. Sorry. No. He supported his whole family. He toured with conducting ensembles all over Russia, and actually didn't get to study until rather late. He was offered a professorship at the Imperial Conservatory on condition that he convert to Russian Orthodox. They were Jewish. He refused, and finally they gave him the job anyway. Michael Press, my grandfather, ended up on the original faculty of Curtis when it opened, teaching violin and sharing conducting with Leopold Stokowski of the Curtis Orchestra. His brother Joseph Press, the cellist in the Russian Trio, also came to the United States. He was the first cello teacher hired by Eastman when it opened. So, and then there are my mother and her sisters, and then there's me. So it's all the way back. Now, I want to add a few details that are interesting. One of them has to do with teaching. It was very, very different then. I've spoken with many people, including students of my grandmother who are still alive. The teaching in Russia was severe, humiliating. It was beyond anything that would be acceptable in the United States now. I've had conversations also. I have a dear friend who went up through the Italian music system in the 1950s and 60s. He said it was a reign of terror. Shouting, pulling hair, stopping people after two notes, saying they were terrible, screaming at them, humiliating them. Unfortunately, in the United States, no one can get away with this anymore at all. But this was the style of teaching. Not everybody. I don't want to make too big a generalization. But this was more the case than not. Now, so why? Well, I asked one of my grandmother's students, because for them, she came straight from the Rubinsteins and Ferruccio Busoni. What they said was that in that time, the only thing that was important was to make great musicians. In this case, great pianists. It was not about the person, it was not about their feelings, it was not about how sensitive they were, it was about music and the piano and nothing else. And if they couldn't take it, they were out. So I don't know how any of you feel about this as I'm describing it. I have to say in my own lifetime, I've witnessed plenty of humiliating situations, especially in classes and in master classes. And I figured since my own teachers were born in the early part of the last century, that their teachers perhaps treated them that way also. I hated it. In my particular case, if anybody was cruel to me, I fought back. Now, legitimate criticism is another thing, but the way this was handled in the past, apparently it was handled very, very badly. What else can I tell you? Yes, actually, on the subject of teaching, I did have something else I wanted to say, and this pertains to my own life as a teacher. So out of this system, I saw many examples in my own lifetime when I was younger, not so young, in master classes given by other people. In my own lifetime, things switched, at least in this country. And I had the situation, two problems. One was students came to study with me who had been treated with relentless criticism. When I told them how beautifully they played, they despised me. It was one of the most frustrating things that ever happened to me. They didn't trust me. They couldn't believe that I just said, but that's beautiful. I loved that. Now, the two people I'm thinking of then went on to win competitions, so maybe they forgave me for the praise that I offered them. And then there was the other situation which I dealt with as a teacher. There was a reaction against this harsh teaching, and anyway, it would not be tolerated in American institutions of higher learning. And what happened was it kind of flipped. And especially when student evaluations began to play a role in how the teachers responded and considered their own jobs, I had many, many students who came to me whose teachers, I felt, and I could be doing them an injustice, the teachers had been afraid to actually tell them the things they needed to work on. Because with certain people, any kind of criticism could be considered insulting. And then I was faced, when people came to audition for me, I pointed out several things. And these people had never heard any criticism, or at least not of the kind that I offered. And so I had the other problem of making myself believed both when I praised people and when I offered constructive criticism. How this relates to the way all of you out there are studying, one thing I can say for sure, that it is not acceptable in American institutions these days. I mean, I heard a story of a famous Russian pianist throwing a chair at one of her students. Now, not every teacher was like this, but the general atmosphere was very harsh. Some of you may think, well, yes, it's a tough career. If you can't take it, maybe you shouldn't be doing it. But the way this was done is something that I very much disapproved of, and which, in my own case, I tried very hard never to humiliate somebody in a public setting. In a private setting, I said what I thought. I tried to be honest. I tried to be helpful. I tried to give good information, and I tried to be kind. Well, any of you who have done any teaching, you know that's a very, very hard set of things to combine. And of course, I wasn't always successful. So let's see, what else can I tell you about my family? So yes, I'm the fourth generation. There's the Press family, Isaac, Michael, and Joseph, the daughters, and me. And then the side from Moscow, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, her daughter, my grandmother, who studied with her and then went on to the Moscow Conservatory and ended up here. And I think I've mentioned this in an earlier chat. I actually went all the way through college studying something else. Too long to tell the story again. But I arrived at age 22 as an amateur cellist who'd really never been to music school. I was a grad student at Harvard, and I was very unhappy. I didn't know whether I have the music gene. I don't know what it was. But I felt I simply had to try to become a musician. And that's what I did. I dropped out of Harvard. I actually became a student at NEC. I studied with Mr. Starker. I went into the Army Band for 3 years during the Vietnam War. Then I got into the Cleveland Orchestra. Now, going back to the 19th century, one of the things that occurred to me, as I said, all of you had relatives. And I'm not saying my family is any more interesting than your families, but whether it's from North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, all of you had ancestors living in 1850. And this was a world so different from ours. It was a pre-modern world. There was a telegraph. Of course, there were trains. I think steamships I'm not sure they had quite begun to cross the Atlantic yet, but this is a world. I mean, there are videos, early films taken in Moscow, of people riding through the streets of Moscow in horse-drawn sleighs over the snow. But the point I was about to make is, if I brought my great-grandmother, who I think died around 1920, this is the one who studied with Nikolai Rubinstein and took Tchaikovsky's classes in harmony. If I brought her back, I blindfolded her, and somehow I managed to take her into one of our conservatories, doesn't matter where, our major conservatories, and I had her walk around the practice rooms. She'd be perfectly at home. She would hear Bach, Haydn, Mozart, and all the 19th century composers. Maybe occasionally she would hear something different, but the point I'm trying to make is I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, we have all these marvelous treasures that we still play and love and study. I just imagine all the music that I just mentioned. I mean, all the 19th century music. This was their new music. What is that? Do we have a message? I don't know what that is. That was their new music. If you brought any of your relatives back to this world, they wouldn't know what was going on. But my relatives would be completely at home in a conservatory today. I was starting to say I'm of two minds about this. Everything else has moved forward. People, I don't know what that is, I'm sorry. And Will, I haven't gotten any questions yet. I don't think I have I?
No, not as of yet.
Okay. Yes, I'm of two minds about this. I was starting to say, I think it's wonderful that we have these masterpieces that we still love and play and study and work on. But all the other arts have moved on. People will listen. People will watch movies. Well, they hadn't been invented yet. They will read new novels, new poetry. They will look at new paintings. They will read new poetry. They will look at new sculpture. All of the arts have moved on, but the gap that exists between audiences today, I'm very sorry about this. The gap that seems to exist still in today's world between a lot of modern music and audiences is something that we haven't bridged yet. And I think I understand it. I played in the string quartet, the Composers Quartet, where we played all of Elliott Carter's string quartets. And it was very difficult music to learn. I have not listened to them again after I learned them, but I did. I'm sorry. What is going on here? No. I'm sorry. Well, if anybody's out there, how about asking me a question? Because it would be nice if I got to actually answer some questions about. It is a cello chat after all. Anybody out there? Anybody want to ask a question? I'd be happy to answer it. Okay. Good. Okay. Question from Jonathan. I'm going to read the questions. What are your thoughts on the evolution of the different schools of music? Jonathan, what schools, if you wouldn't mind sending me another message, what schools do you mean? Do you mean the different strands of music, the different kinds of modern music? Please tell me what you mean, because do you mean the different schools of modern music? Please write something else if you don't mind, so I can have a chance at. Okay, good. Okay, sorry, good. Not now. Well, I don't know what you mean. Whether it's the way we play the old music of Italy and Germany and Russia, or the new schools. I'm going to assume that you're talking about older music. Well, the way that the Italian Baroque music is played now, the way Bach is played, has been a revolution from when I was young. I played some Bach with Pablo Casals conducting, and it might as well have been. He was born the same decade as my grandmother. By the way, I forgot to mention my grandmother was in school with Rachmaninoff and knew him. So I like the way the music has changed. I like the more clear, more articulate, lighter way of playing the Baroque, all of the Baroque music. The Russian music, this is the Russian music is still played pretty much the way it was played back then. And I mentioned that Anton Rubinstein was the founder of the Russian School of Piano Playing. He had many famous students who lived on into the 20th century. I'm not sure where Rachmaninoff studied with him. But I don't know that the Russian music is played so very differently from the way it was played back then. It's been a more conservative musical world during Soviet times. What's happening now? I don't know how much new music is played there. But if you meant the older music, the Baroque music, oh, I think it's a huge improvement. Okay. Question from Brennan McCade. Hi, Michael. To combine a more technical subject with the music lineage, did Piatigorsky give you any advice as a tall, long-armed cellist? No. When I was in the Piatigorsky class, we did not have any lessons. We had 2 classes a week. It was probably between 3 and 5 hours long. I think I mentioned in an earlier chat. So we all showed up, let's say, at 9 o'clock. And at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when I'd sit there for 4 hours, hungry, tired, and terrified, Piatigorsky would say, Michael, play the Rococo variations. I was ready to die. First of all, I'm not as... I am tall, but he was extraordinarily tall. He had very large hands. He was a fantastic cellist. But no, the things that he mostly talked about, the things that he always talked about, were musical things. But since you asked me, there are 2 things I believe he said, which I used very effectively in my own teaching. And it had miraculous effects on the student who was playing. One was use the stick and feel the string. Those 2 phrases allowed me and many people I taught to suddenly feel, oh wait, I have something to touch here, something to feel, something to work with, rather than just passing the bow over the string. But no, I don't recall that he ever spoke about my long arms. He sure spoke a lot about a lot of other things. Okay, question from Robert Hausman. Can you describe what were the general ideas you learned from your various teachers? Yes. From Mr. Starker, I learned a comprehensive approach to building a technique on the cello that worked. He was a great master. He was, frankly, he was a wizard. He left nothing unspoken about and undone. And from studying with him, scales in thirds, sixths, and octaves, arpeggios, shifting exercises, trill exercises, etudes. You know, Mr. Starker studied with a student of David Popper. Popper was a big part of our studies. So to Mr. Starker, I owe the fact that I ever learned to play the cello. I was an amateur. When I was 23, I was a not very promising amateur. I left a year later to go into the Army band. I had to. It was a draft at that point. And I had the foundation of a technique that I could develop. And then I studied with his friend Mihaly Virizlay, who was a principal cellist in Baltimore at the time. I got into the Cleveland Orchestra when I got out of the Army. Okay, from Piatigorsky, he was a coach. And he was a great artist and a person of enormous temperament and humor and stories. And so what he brought out in me, because I quit the Cleveland Orchestra to go study with him. I knew I had to improve my playing. I had been in music school a total of 2.5 years of my whole life. It wasn't enough. So from him, yes. Now, earlier, I studied with many other people, and I can tell you what I picked up from them. The joy of being a musician. They enjoyed it. They lived it. I felt that growing in myself. I felt that this was the only life that I could possibly live that would be a satisfying life for me. So it was less about the cello than picking up, watching older teachers who loved music, and I loved music. But yes, I identified with them. And so, like I said, finally, I was a grad student at Harvard. I dropped out. I became a sophomore at the England Conservatory and started all over again. I hope I answered your question. Okay, question from Peter. Can you describe the various teaching styles that you have experienced either directly or indirectly in your career? What were the pros and cons of each? Well, there's no pro at all about humiliating people. That's out. I'm telling you what I have seen in master classes. I'm not going to mention any names. You know, these were guys born in the earlier part of the last century. Their teachers were born in the 19th century, and that's what I was talking about earlier. There was a very harsh system. Now, probably, if they were here, said, look, Michael, this is a very hard career. And, you know, if you can't take a good bit of browbeating in a lesson and have people, you know, be a bit nasty to you and expose your weaknesses, you're never going to make it in the world. How are you going to take an audition? How are you going to play concertos and concerts? Well, that may be so. But I have to tell you, I found that a very negative thing. People who offered me constructive criticism, no matter how directly it was offered, I lapped it up. I knew I needed to improve. Anybody who was deliberately mean or cruel to me, I fought them and I left. So the positive kind of teaching, actually, most of my teachers were nice people. Unfortunately, partly because, you know, again, I mentioned this in an earlier chat, I grew up in North Africa. I grew up in Morocco. So I did not have a lot of good teaching when I was young. I left New York when I was 12. I had started a year and a half before. And then there was a kind of a big blank. But what I remember about them is mostly that they were very nice people. Actually, I found markings in a piece that my cello professor in Casablanca wrote in a book of Sevcek etudes. I was astonished. He wrote everything in. These were very diligent, well-meaning people. But the only thing I can say is, yes, it's hard. Yes, you're going to have to, taking an orchestra audition, playing recitals, getting up and playing a concerto, I don't know anybody who doesn't get extremely nervous. Whether it's a good idea to force people to go through that kind of torture in a lesson, I'm against it. So everything that is positive, everything that is useful, everything that is specific. In other words, Mr. Starker, to whom I owe my great descent, he didn't just talk. He showed me exactly how to practice, what muscles were used, how to monitor and regulate the use of, we have to use our muscles to play. I mean, muscular contraction is our friend. If I don't contract any muscles, I can't do anything. But he was very specific in everything that he offered to me. And because I basically had to start over again, I did everything he told me. I ended up actually learning to play the cello on a reasonably high level. Question from Alan. What artists have been most influential to you in your life so far? In what ways have they affected your approach to music? Well, yes, I can tell you. From the time I was a child, there was music in my house. Remember, my mother was the daughter of Michael Press, the violinist who was on the original faculty of Curtis. Music, music, music. And I was open to it from the time I was a child. And it's records that I listened to. But by the time I began playing the cello, I was way behind on the cello. But I had heard all the Beethoven symphonies, the string quartets, piano concertos, lots of operas, Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, all kinds of things. And the effect that had, because I'm talking about 1940s, 50s, we didn't have YouTube then. The effect that listening to recordings, because I didn't go to a lot of concerts, that shaped my entire musical aesthetic. String quartets, well, I had all the Budapest string quartet recordings. So that was by listening. Listening was a big influence. The next thing, when I was in the Army Band, all of us, a whole group of people in Indiana, Joseph Gingold students, Mr. Starker students, Fritz Mogg students, we all got into trouble because we were all going to be drafted. We all ended up in the military bands in Washington. I played chamber music for 3 years. We were friends already. I played chamber music for 3 years with some of the best of Joseph Gingold's students, people who became concert masters, Ray Kobler, Andy Zaplatinsky, Alan Deverich, who was principal viola of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, Danny Rothmuller, cellist, who was in the LA Philharmonic, and many, many more. And by playing chamber music, the whole repertoire, that is where I learned a lot. But between listening and playing a lot of chamber music, I hope I answered your question, because in my generation, all we could do was go to concerts or listen to recordings. And I hope I answered your question. What was it like to be a cellist in the Army band? Well, well, so at that time, I was going to be drafted, like many other young men. I had a friend who was a cellist in the string group at the Army band. He called me in Bloomington. I was studying with Mr. Starker. He said, they have an opening. Well, I went to Washington and I got in. And, but I had to enlist. If you were drafted, it was 2 years. I had to enlist for 3 years. Then I had 9 weeks of basic training at Fort Knox. That was a real learning experience. Actually, it was a good one. I mean, I did, of course, I wasn't sent to Vietnam. In the band, we played at state dinners at the White House. We played at parties for drunken Vietnamese generals. Actually, to be honest with you, we almost only worked in the evening, which meant I could practice all day long. And I did practice all day, not all day long. And I have to tell you, my friends made fun of me. Oh, Haber's home practicing 4 or 5 hours a day. They stopped making fun of me when in October 1968 I got on a plane in an Army uniform, half price, for my first audition, and George Szell hired me to join the Cleveland Orchestra. So actually, I shouldn't talk about being in the Army lightheartedly. It's just in my particular case, you're looking at a really lucky guy because I wasn't sent to Vietnam. So I mostly practiced, and actually, since you asked, now it's a good job. Then I had to go in. I know we were paid a couple of $1,000s a year. It was enough to live on then. Everything cost a lot less at that time. But actually, what was it like? I hated it. I hated the Army. I could never decide who liked each other the least, whether I liked the Army less or they liked me less. And I remember my hand was trembling the last day I got out of the Army to sign my name and be done with it. Let's see, do we have any other questions? Come on, everybody. There must be somebody out there with a question. I'm eager to answer your questions, please. Well, okay, so until one comes in, what else was I going to tell you about the past? Well, yes, I mean, the period of time that my ancestors lived through had disasters that are unimaginable to those of us living now, especially if you lived in Russia, actually anywhere in Europe. There was the First World War. There was the Russian Revolution. And actually, what happened to my ancestors, they had a very hard time. They didn't feel they could stay in Europe. They came here, they didn't speak a word of English. They were well-known musicians, and they got good jobs. My grandfather conducted the Boston Symphony, he conducted the Philadelphia Orchestra, he played concerts. Oh, Dorothy DeLay studied with him. My grandfather went from Curtis to Michigan State University sometime in the late 1920s, and Dorothy DeLay studied with him there. If I guess what I'm getting around to saying, by being the first member of my family born in this country, I'm a really, really lucky guy, because both my grandparents and their daughters went through a very, very hard time. They arrived during my mother and her sisters arrived during the Depression. So again, I'm just saying, I'm a very lucky guy to have been born in this country. Isn't there anybody else out there who would like to ask me a question? I have a lot of information to offer. Okay. Isaac, question from Isaac. What are your thoughts on the changes in trends of cello playing from the 1900s to now? You know, on YouTube, you can find recordings of cellists born in the 1850s who lived into the early recording era. They were great. By the way, the cello has been played on a high level for several hundred years. To give you an example, Beethoven begged Bernhard Romberg to let him write a cello concerto for him. I mean, can you imagine? Can you imagine what kind of a cellist Romberg must have been? Now, it would have sounded completely different from the way we played. There was no end pin. the strings were gut, everything was on a smaller scale. But what I've heard when I listened to those guys, first of all, they were great masters. The vibrato was much more concentrated. Oh, by the way, on the subject of YouTube, if anybody's interested, I have a YouTube channel. I have posted recordings of Michael and Joseph Press. Michael's recordings are made in the 1920s. They're better fidelity. There's one from 1909. It's made in somebody's apartment where they are playing my grandfather's transcription of the Handel Halverson Passacaglia. He's the one who transcribed it for violin and cello. So how has cello playing evolved? Well, Piatigorsky studied with Julius Klengel. I think so did Feuermann. Klengel had his feet all the way in the 19th century. And so I think the tradition continued. The big thing that has changed is that in earlier days, if you look at videos of Jascha Heifetz playing, of Feuermann playing, of Arthur Rubinstein playing the piano, there is no faces, there's no moving around, there's no telegraphing. Hello, everybody. This is what the piece means. There is a confidence that the audience will get the piece without your showing through your body language and facial expressions what the piece is supposed to convey. I think most, if not all, of the musicians of that period played in that style. And then in our own lifetimes, it's become common because I think people have lost confidence because we're so far away now from the 19th century. Tchaikovsky, I have their original edition of the Tchaikovsky Piano Trio that my grandparents played from. This is a long time ago. And I think there's been a loss of confidence that people can understand the music without having program notes and the face and the body language and the bows come up and all of that. I think it was a more modest kind of playing, not on a lower level. But then in my own lifetime, the volume of playing, the strings that are used, everything has become much, much more powerful. And I suppose it needed to. I'm not being critical of it, but you asked how things have changed, and I think you can hear many recordings of string players born in the mid-19th century. The playing is simple, noble, direct, and it is not exaggerated. We live in a time now, from my point of view, where everything has become very exaggerated. I'm not criticizing it, I'm just describing it. I hope that was helpful. Okay. Okay, just a second here. Oh, sorry. Greeting. Oh, Martha, hi. I love you, Martha. I want to see you soon. Okay, Su Wen Wang, Maestro. I would like to ask that do you have any suggestions for shifting with relaxing to the high position, like the first movement of Brahms' cello sonata in F major? Whoops. I am not prepared to play that for you right now, but I don't think I am. But okay, I'll tell you what I did. I actually got the notes. You impressed? So, what I learned about shifting was that you prepare the shift. You don't stay, and then you move in a jerky way. This is what Mr. Starker taught, a very subtle movement of the elbow in the direction of the shift. So the arm this part of the arm has already completed part of the shift, and the hand follows afterwards. And the same when you go down, the same thing. I remember other people just raise the arm. That is how I learned to shift. It was very effective. That for the preparation, that you don't just stay and then shift, but that when you're on this note. Look at that, and watch. That's how I learned to shift. I hope if that didn't answer your question, please ask it again. But everything has to do with preparation. Everything in my playing, bow changes, I prepare them. Shifts, I prepare them. Everything is meant to flow, and nothing is meant to be bright. Not change the bow like that, but like that. Not shift like that, but shift like that. Okay, I hope that was helpful. If it wasn't, please ask the question again. Question from Christian Sandrigal. Thought.
I think you were looking at the questions from our last cello chat. Do you mind scrolling down?
Sorry. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry. Where am I? From who? From whom? Sorry. Okay, Rob, just a second. Okay, just a second. Okay, sorry. Is this Rebecca? No.
Robert?
Oh, no, sorry. This keeps going back. Okay, Robert. Have you read Piatigorsky's book, Cellist? If so, what are your thoughts? Well, he was a character. Oh, what happened here? Wait, cancel. No, I lost all the questions. William, all the questions disappeared. No, wait a minute. Okay, just 1 second. Okay, wait a minute. No. Just a second. I can't see any of the questions. I'm sorry. You'll have to read the questions for me. The link to Hangouts completely died.
Robert asks, what was it like? Have you read Piatigorsky's book, Cellist?
Okay, I'm sorry about that. It just disappeared. He was a larger-than-life character. He was a tall, handsome guy. How many of his stories are accurate? That I can't tell you. But yes, I did read the book. But I can tell you how to get more information about him. My friend Terry King, who was Piatigorsky's assistant, wrote a biography of Gregor Piatigorsky. You could find it on Amazon. And in that book, you'll find out everything that you would like to know about Gregor Piatigorsky. William, I'm really sorry. This just completely died on me. Do we have other questions?
We have a question from Bene asking, what is the most important thing if you want to learn the vibrato? I have difficulties with my third and fourth finger.
I couldn't hear it. Could you say it again?
Bene asks, what is the most important thing if you want to learn the vibrato? I have difficulties with my third and fourth finger.
Okay. Well, let me tell you how I learned to vibrate. Because when I came to Mr. Starker, I was so tight, I literally couldn't vibrate. So, what he taught me was that the vibrato comes from the arm. And the first exercise he gave me was a movement like this, and then I finally made my fingertip sink into the string, and I kept the motion going. So, the basic principle was that the vibrato came from the arm. Now, so that's the first thing. The other thing that I learned, do you see how I'm continuing the vibrato motion as I change fingers? This is what I'm doing. The motion comes from the arm, and then I put each finger down, and so the vibrato continues from finger to finger. So the third and fourth fingers, from my point of view, because I'm creating the vibrato from my arm, it doesn't matter which finger I'm playing with. It's the same motion, and I don't play on my fingertip. I play in the meatier part of the finger, which I think makes a warmer sound. I'm really sorry about this, everybody. I was receiving the questions on a Google chat, and the whole thing quit on me. So if I didn't answer your question, if I didn't answer it well, please let me know, and I'm sorry for the breakdown in the communication. Do we have any other questions?
Let's see. No, not at the moment. So I think we'll jump to the into practice room questions, starting
Sure.
with the first one, which is what is on your music stand right now? What are you working on?
Well, I got interested in the transcriptions of the Bach chaconne for cello. And I actually contacted, there are several performances on YouTube. One is by, I think, Jonah Kim, a Russian cellist. There's several of them. Also a Dutch Baroque cellist. It's always been one of my favorite pieces of music. So I have that on my stand, and I thought it would be interesting for me to work on it. And I also, at this particular point in my life, I'm always doing all of the technical work that allowed me to finally learn to play on a professional level. Scales, thirds, sixths, and octaves, arpeggios, trill exercises, shifting exercises, bowing exercises on open strings, bowing exercises for different strokes. Somebody once asked me about a staccato. I do it. I do it. I do it from my fingers. So it's like this. So did that answer your question?
Great. The next question is what is the first thing you do on the cello every day?
The first thing that I do every day is make sure that I can make a ringing, singing sound with the bow. For many years, I always began with open strings, because if I can make the room I'm in ring and sing, then if I'm making this kind of a sound on the open string, well, when I add the finger, I'm going to have the same freedom and warmth and volume that I had. So the first thing that I always do is work on open strings. And on that subject, Fritz Maag's book, Cello Exercises, has a set of exercises on open strings at the beginning. I still do part of them because I memorized them. It's very useful. For those of you who are not familiar with Fritz Maag's name, he was a principal cello teacher at Indiana. He had been the principal cellist of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, a wonderful cellist and a wonderful teacher. And his book, Cello Exercises, is something that I'd recommend.
Why do you practice? What drives and motivates you? Anything that helped during the pandemic?
Say that again.
Why do you practice? What drives and motivates you? Anything that helped during the pandemic?
Well, I have a flame burning in me. It never goes out. And the only way I can answer your question is music was a calling for me. I tried to resist it. I mean, I was old when I started, and it was kind of unlikely that I would make it. But that flame never goes out. Music has been a path to joy for me. The practicing, the rehearsing, the learning new pieces, it opened a whole world to me that was full of meaning and beauty. And nothing has ever come between me and the role that music has played in my life. So actually, I've never needed to inspire myself. The music always called to me. The task of learning to play well, which I couldn't do when I was young, and the dream that one day I could actually play the cello and play music and make it sound beautiful, which I couldn't do when I started. So I have to say that it might sound strange, but nothing gets in the way of my lifelong love for and my relationship to music and striving to become a better musician. I'm still doing it. I'm 80 years old.
We have a question from Sebastian asking, when you perform, do you view yourself as a complete medium from the composer to the audience? Or rather, do you keep a piece of yourself present to add character for a performance?
Okay. I'll tell you what I try to do. Whether I can always do it is another question. I'm an ordinary guy. But when I play music, I become something different. And what I try to do is let the composer take over. that I'm not playing the piece. The composer is playing the piece through me. That I'm a puppet that the composer picks up and moves, and when the piece is over, I'm just a puppet again. However, in order to have a chance to let myself go that way and just live the piece while I'm playing it on stage, which it's very hard, I have to have prepared to a level. I mean, I have to tell you, now that I don't practice all that much, because my career is basically over, I realize now that 75% of my practice time was spent convincing myself that I was well enough prepared to face the pressure. I mean, I got up and played 15 or 16 different cello concertos. It was not easy. And I don't think I always played them all that well. I wanted to play everything that I taught. I did. I played everything. But it is the preparation and the sense that even though you're frightened or nervous, the preparation is there. Now, let the composer take over. And then, no, of course, you might think, well, sure, but that's yes, it's my feeling about the composer. I can't have some other feeling than the feelings that the composer imposes on me or arouses in me through the piece that I'm playing. I hope that was an answer to your question, but the most significant part of my answer is a preparation. You have everybody I know, and I'm friends with several very famous musicians. They all practice. They practice and practice and practice, because it's one thing to play in the practice room. Oh, I sound great. It's wonderful, and then you get out on stage and, what am I doing here? This does not feel at all like it felt at home. And the only way that I can prepare myself for that is with an extensive amount of preparation for a long time before the concert. I hope that answered your question. The idea is for me to let go. And through the preparation that I had, the technical preparation I made, that as far as I can understand the composer, which of course it has to be limited, it's his piece, her piece, not mine. And let it flow through me, through the cello and out into the air. That's what I hope to do.
What do you enjoy the most about practicing? What inspires you? Is it all classical, or are there inspirations outside of this genre?
Well, the only kind of music that I've played in my lifetime, and I explained to you why. I mean, 4 generations of classical musicians, starting with a woman who was in Tchaikovsky's harmony class. What chance did I have to do anything else? And the grandfather who was on the faculty of Curtis. So it's all been classical music. Now I like lots of other kinds of music. Has reading, has poetry, has painting. Yes, I mean, there have been times when I saw a painting, let's say by Rembrandt, and I thought, oh my gosh, if I could create that kind of color, that mystery, that depth, that humanity, or Van Gogh, another one of my, the fantasy, the colors, no, it's only been classical music. I've loved the quest to become a good musician. It's been hard, but I have to tell you, I read someplace when you found your true profession when you don't mind the grunt work that has to be done. I enjoyed practicing. I know plenty of people who hate practicing, I found deep side. It was always moving me along a road toward the goal of playing well.
How do you cultivate inspiration in the practice room? What motivates you?
How do I what?
Cultivate inspiration in the practice room. What motivates you?
The music. The music does. Nothing but the music. Now, are practicing thirds, sixths, and octaves and arpeggios and paparetos, is that inspiring? Well, it can be done. I mean, that's important. I made sure that when I did that, I did it with some imagination, with absolute requirement that it sounded good. I remember I once walked into my office and the student was practicing. They go, I said, no, it's not supposed to sound like that. He was doing thirds. Uh, but the goal is always something beautiful. Now, somebody could say, well, come on, Mr. Haber, come on, Michael. Not all music is meant to be beautiful. Although I mostly talked about the Romantic period, fine. I played Elliott Carter's string quartets. Are they beautiful? No. That's a different aesthetic. I played lots of new music. So, actually, I did have to, all of us, we all have to learn to use the cello to produce what the music asks. When I was in the Cleveland Orchestra, Pierre Boulez was the music director for the second season we had. So we played all kinds of pieces that demanded a different kind of technique and a different kind of touch from what let's say we had done with George Szell. But everything, whether it's a shifting exercise or a Bach suite or a concerto, it all has the same goal. It has the same goal of something that is going to be worth listening to, worth for me to listen to and work on, and worth somebody else listening to. That for me, I became a musician for myself. This is what I needed to do. I needed to work on this, but I also wanted to be a performer and play in public. So the whole thing worked into something that was both a fulfillment of personal need of mine, a personal love for music, and also the desire to eventually become a professional, which I did.
In your mind, what is it that makes an effective practice session?
Oh, concentration. Oh, it's okay. I think I might have spoken about this before. People, all of us, we have the degree to which we can concentrate, by which I mean focusing your mind on something, it varies from hour to hour and day to day. For example, there are some days I was able to practice for an hour or two without losing my concentration. By concentration, I mean actively listening, asking myself, is that what I want to sound like? And if not, what do I need to do the next time I play it to correct it, to improve it? There are other times after 10 minutes, I found my concentration slipping. Now, I had two techniques to deal with that. One was, I put something else on the stand. There's no reason to do third, sixth, octave, everything and then repertoire. You have to do all of it to maintain a good technique and learn pieces, but they don't have to be done in any particular order. I mean, I have to confess, I fell into, for most of my life, always doing the technical work first. But when I found that I was bored or that I lacked interest in what I was doing, well, I put the piece on the stand that I was working on. More often than not, my interest was renewed. And by interest, I mean I was actively able to listen to myself, pay attention, and do problem solving. There's a little formula: plan, play, judge. You make a plan, you play, you make your judgment. And you go through a plan, play, judge sequence hundreds of times in a practice session. Make a plan, you play, you listen, you make, no, it's not what I want. You make a new plan. So the key thing is to be gentle with yourself. Some days one can't practice, and there's no point in practicing when your mind's on vacation and you're just moving your fingers. I remember Gregor Piatigorsky said the fingers are stupid. It has to be the mind that is informing them what to do and why to do it. But the most important thing is you have to pay attention to yourself and be honest with yourself. There's so many times when I realized I wasn't practicing well. Was I always able to do what I'm telling everybody? Well, of course not. I'm just human. I'm sorry, I have to tell an anecdote again. One day in class, Gregor Piatigorsky said something priceless. He said, every mistake you will make, every mistake you have made, I made it before you. And that was a moment of humility on his part, because he was one of the greats. And so I have made, just the way he did, plenty of mistakes. But the answer to your question is, don't practice when your mind's on vacation and your fingers are just moving. Do either take a break or switch what you are practicing so that maybe your attention can be renewed.
Is there a particular practice method that you swear by that has remained of constant value for you over the years? A go-to strategy?
Well, I'm an example of somebody who needed to follow the traditional way of building a good, reliable technique on the stringed instruments. I suppose there are some people who don't need to. I think those are very few. But it was step by step increasing the difficulty of, I've mentioned these things already, the violinists came before us. They had technique books, they had all kinds of ways, they were way in advance of the cellists for probably 100 years, so we kind of caught up. I always did scales, I always did thirds, sixths, and octaves, shifting exercises. Oh, these are the standard building blocks of a good technique. And something I also mentioned another time, I read an interview with Jascha Heifetz many, many years ago, and he said, no matter how much he practiced, how long he practiced, he divided his practice session into half. Half was devoted to whatever you want to include under technique, which is all the scales, thirds, octaves, etudes, trill exercises, and half to repertoire. I tried my entire lifetime to follow that regime, because if I fell into just practicing pieces and I didn't make sure that the key, I'll give you an example. If I told my students, 3 minutes a day, please, octaves, 3 minutes a day, that's all, but every day, you will learn to play octaves well. You might not like practicing them, but it'll help you. Same with all the other things. Well, if you don't do that and you get to the Dvorak Concerto or Haydn D Major or Saint-Saëns, any of the concertos that need octaves, and you haven't, that isn't locked into what you can do, you can't play the piece. I tried to cover every aspect of a good technique on the cello, that anything you can name. I tried to do parts of it every day. And then I divided my practice up. So I think that's the best answer I can give you. Half technique, half repertoire, listening all the time, concentrating, doing the best that I can to keep moving my level up. Now, I'm talking about 60 years of practicing. And I practiced this morning. I'm not so eager to play in public anymore. It was kind of enough, but I love playing. And I still love the idea of improving. I'm not going to make the boast that Pablo Casals did when he was around 90. He said, I think I'm still improving. But anyway, maybe I am. Some things I'm able to hear better. I think I've become, my intonation was always good, but I think that I've made some very subtle changes. And if I had the time, I came along at a time when people were playing half steps astonishingly close, kind of expressive intonation. When I listen to some of my performances, I actually cringe. Some of them are so tight. So I feel like I've readjusted my sense of how to play half steps, thirds and sixths also. It's been interesting. So I hope that was an adequate answer to your question. It's kind of a traditional approach to technique with everything that the violinists led us, and the cellist came afterwards. And I haven't learned all of the repertoire, but a huge part of it.
What are the best ways to prevent injury?
Oh. I have to talk again about Mr. Starker's teaching. Because when I came to him, I was so tight. I was so tight I couldn't vibrate. And with all due respect to the people I had studied with before, they had no idea how to help me. Now, I'm not going to blame it on them. Maybe I was just the kind of student that you can't be helpful to everybody. But anyway, I arrived in Bloomington at age 23 and a half, unable to play. And I had to start all over again from the beginning, because what I was doing was not going to lead any further. And the basis of what I learned from Mr. Starker was the alternation of tension and relaxation. And I don't know if I have the time to go into this, but it's the only way I can answer your question. Let me start with the left hand. What he taught was the only finger that has tension in it is the one that's playing. Right now, there's playing tension in my first finger. When my second finger comes down, my first finger relaxes, and so on and so forth. So my hand, my left hand, it's like little on and off switches. I'm never gripping. I'm never, if I have to play a double stop, of course, there's tension in two fingers. But there's a constant alternation of tension and relaxation. The only part that has any muscular contraction in it is the one that's working. A lot of people, their whole hand is tight. So that was point number one. Shifting. This has to do with, I'm going to get to the bow in a moment if we have time. The question of shifting was not to make jerky motions, and that to demonstrate it, that rather than doing that a very subtle, you can see my arm is leading. Part of the shift has been completed, and now my hand just follows. Now watch. Part of the shift I'm completing, and my hand follows. So that was the basis of using the left hand without cramping and squeezing. Now, with the bow, it was very similar, because at the frog, the energy which comes from the back, not from the hand and arm, is directly above the string. At the tip, the energy is out here. So how are we going to get there? So what he taught was that the hand is very relaxed at the frog, and as you go out, there is a torquing motion in the first finger, so that you sustain an even sound. Now, here's the key thing. Right now, my hand has enough tension in it to be making the same volume of sound that I made at the frog. Now, when I come back, you see what I'm doing with my hand? I've released all the tension. So very relaxed here as I go to the tip to sustain the sound, because this is just a tool to keep the string in vibration. I don't care if it's a piquot or a factory bow. The tool is just this bow is just a tool to keep the string in vibration. So an even sound, relaxed hand, more tension, because I have to use the stick to make energy. I turn around, and my hand relaxes as I come back. And then, where continuity, so we don't go like that. What he taught was kind of, it's a circular motion, kind of like that. I think other teachers teach figure eights, but the basic idea was my bow hand, I never got tight, because I was never using my hand in the same way. And every inch I went during the bow stroke, I was using my hand in a different way. It was either more relaxed or a little bit more tense, but it never stayed the same. And the way people hurt themselves is by clamping and gripping and squeezing. And on that subject, in my teaching, I have to say, a lot of the problems that I've seen were people trying to make what is called the big sound. Well, it's possible. Actually, a big sound is made by being relaxed, by releasing weight all the way from the back into the cello through the bow, but with a very, very live vibrato. But what happens is when people, it's an emotional thing, playing the cello, making music, and people do this, and you do enough of this. I had several students who came to me who had injured themselves so badly that they were unable to keep playing, and I couldn't do anything for them. So I've spoken maybe too much, but the key thing was to understand exactly how you are using your own body in relation to the cello, and the variety of ways that you use it, the flowing motions, preparing the bow, preparing the shifts, having the bow hand never having the same level of intensity in the hand at different parts of the bow, very relaxed here, less relaxed here, because you have to use the stick. And with the left hand, the on-off switch for every finger, so that when I put my second finger down, I don't have to lift my first finger. There's no playing tension in it at all. So all of this was very basic stuff. And once I began to understand it, and he was a wonderful explainer. I've heard stories that Mr. Starker was cruel, or Mr. Starker was the most patient, kind person I ever met in my cello studies, because I was not a gifted person, but he felt I could learn if he gave me the information to learn with, and he never gave up. He never gave up on me. And I remember one day I came in, I made a nice vibrato. He said, "Oh, you broke the sound barrier." I'll never forget that. But I could, if I was tight, I couldn't vibrate. Once I got this motion, once I was able to make this motion coming from the arm, not from the fingers or the forearm, but from the arm, then I began to have a good vibrato. But a very long answer to your question, one has to be brainy about how one uses one's body. Now, probably somebody's thinking, yeah, but does Pinchas Zuckerman or Itzhak Perlman or these kinds of people, do they do that? I don't know. But they do. Either they do it intuitively. Oh, I played with a wonderful violinist who's no longer alive, James Buswell. We had a trio together for 20 years. Jamie Buswell told me, he was a great master of the violin. He told me that he was very aware of everything that he did. And these other people that I mentioned, I'm sure they are too. It's just, if you have a knack for something, it's easier to learn it. I did not have a particular knack for the cello, but I learned it. Somebody for whom it's a more natural thing can learn more easily and more quickly. But basically, the last thing I want to say is, I established a set of sensors all over my body and with a readout in my brain. And if anything got too tight, the needle moved into the red area. I was always aware of everything, all the way from my feet up, because I was as liable as anybody else to fall into forcing or to squeeze. So I had a whole system in my mind. You don't play the cello with your hands. Yeah, you have to use them. You play the cello with, you can call it your soul, your mind, but it's also an activity actually where you can steer what's happening with good information and clear thinking while you are playing. Now, after all the years I practiced, most of what I'm talking about, of course, became natural to me. But when I was a student, I was determined to learn to play in a way that was free and efficient. And Mihaly Virizlay, who's a name many of you won't know, a friend of Mr. Starker's, another great cellist, he played in the same way. And so when I was in the Army, I studied with him, and it was all a continuation. And then I showed up in Severance Hall for my first ever audition. I won that audition. Thank you. Thank you, both of them. It's all thanks to them. Well, also I practice hard.
What is your balance between technique and repertoire?
Between what?
Between technique and repertoire.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
What is your balance between technique and repertoire?
Technique and what?
Technique and repertoire.
Oh. Well, forgive me for repeating the same thing. Heifetz divided his practice sessions in two. Half technique, half repertoire. Who in their right mind is going to ignore something Jascha Heifetz recommended? They feed into each other, and actually there is one thing I have to say. Playing music, using the way one uses the bow, it's not like a bowing exercise. It's not like an etude. It's a completely different way of turning sounds into something that is beautiful and meaningful, and it makes sense in the context of the piece. I've had more than one example where people thought the technique, that what you do, the technical part of your work, that's how you play the piece. No, it's not. It's like, I grew up in North Africa, and I learned French perfectly. The grammar, the vocabulary, everything. I memorized everything. But when I had a conversation, I used this stuff in order to speak French fluently. So all of the technical work, which I don't know anybody who doesn't need to do it. Undoubtedly, there must be some people who are very gifted. I kept doing it my whole life, and then I had the resources because you don't you don't use the bow like that in a piece, those sounds, those bow speeds, that was not part of my technical practice. That comes from my asking myself, how should this piece go? But without the technical work, all of that, there are things in everything that I just did, or that, or the first note of the Dvorak Concerto, all those things, or Lalo, or Ramsey Minor, all of those things were possible for two reasons. One, I thought of them. I wanted to sound like that. The other thing was physically, mentally, I was prepared to make those sounds. I hope I answered that adequately.
How do you manage lots of repertoire at the same time?
How to manage what?
How do you manage lots of repertoire at the same time?
Well, I don't have that problem. I noticed that question. That's a question you probably would have to pose to somebody who was an active soloist. Was I ever learning a ton of... Oh, well, wait a minute. I went on a string quartet tour once with 27 string quartets. That was a nightmare. And 3 of them were the 3 quartets that Elliott Carter had written. Most of my life, I was preparing a limited number of pieces. I might have been preparing a recital or two and a set of chamber pieces, but the concerts would unroll over an entire season. There have been very few times when I have been so pressed by time and necessity that I was juggling. I don't know, I'm not sure how many pieces you were referring to, but the only answer I can give you is the more work that I had to do, I worked harder. And I'm remembering there were times when I was under so much pressure, a few times, that then I really had to be careful not to hurt myself. But I'm not an example of somebody, I played hundreds of chamber music concerts, I played concertos, I played recitals, but I didn't do a ton of it in any one season. It wasn't something that I would have been able to do anyway, so I took my time with everything. In fact, since you asked, every concerto that I played, some people are going to think I'm nuts when I say this. The first time I played the Dvorak Concerto, I started 1 year before the concert. 1 year. And I worked on one note at a time, in whole notes. I figured if I can't play the piece in its most basic form, how am I going to get up on stage? And slowly, I started adding in the rhythms and the bowings and the fingerings. But all of my preparation, I'll say I only have one gift, and one gift alone. I'm capable of being very honest with myself. And I'm capable of telling myself that really isn't very good. That does not sound very good. And you have to find a way to work on it. I've never been in denial about my playing, and I've always worked to be honest in the way I listen to myself. But the particular question that you asked, except on rare occasions, wait a minute, it's not true. Okay, in the Piatigorsky class, we had classes Thursday and Sunday. On Thursday, he might say, Michael, come back on Sunday and play, I don't know, the Prokofiev Sonata, or the Rococo, and I hadn't learned it. And I had 3 days not only to learn the piece, but there was a class pianist, but get up in front of a room full of fantastic cellists and play it. I was terrified. But basically, I've always worked hard, but the only reasonable answer I can give to you is when there was more work to do, I worked harder.
How do you start learning a new piece? How does this differ between chamber, orchestral, and solo repertoire?
Every new piece, I'm presenting myself in an idealized way. What I'm telling you is what I should have done and what I sometimes actually did do. All the solo pieces that I learned, with very few exceptions, I had heard somewhere along the way. So I had some idea of how they were supposed to go. But I started slowly. And I tried to find how did I need to manage things so that I could play it well. Because different fingerings. For example, I have a friend, a great admirer of Leonard Rose and a student of his who told me Leonard Rose's fingerings never worked for him. For some reason, they worked for me. So many of his editions, I found those fingerings very, very useful. Well, with the example of the Elliott Carter quartets, I mean, I had to listen. The Composers Quartet, which is the group that I played in, we were in residence at Columbia University. They had played the pieces, and I auditioned, and I got into the quartet. I'd never played them. Well, of course, I listened to their recordings. I mean, if you have not learned, if anybody watching this has not learned those pieces, they are the hardest pieces I ever learned in my entire life. The whole standard repertoire I had heard before. So I started slowly. And I tried not to get ahead of myself. Now, I want to give you an example. I want to mention Jamie Buswell again, who was a great virtuoso of the violin. He told me he learned the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto when he was a kid. But every time he had to play it again, guess what he did? Dum, with the metronome. Bum, ba da dum, ba 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 da ga di ga da. And he moved it up one notch at a time. Because at each notch, if he mastered that, he couldn't fall below that level because he had mastered it. So I often did that kind of thing, especially with very fast pieces. I had to start out slowly. I took that from him, that, you start out at a tempo, you set the challenge that it's difficult enough that it's interesting, but not so difficult that you feel like giving up. I mean, how many students have I taught? They wanted immediately to play, I don't know, the Rococo variations, and so they launched into it, and it was a catastrophe, because it didn't sound good. They had tried to do it too soon, and they became discouraged. So this is something really important about practicing and teaching. The level of the challenge has to be set at the point where it's a challenge, but it's not destructive, so they just feel, I'll never be able to do this. So I got that from Jamie Buswell. I also got from Lynn, who practiced very slowly. Rostropovich's daughter gave me lessons. He practiced slowly. Everything I ever did, I started slowly to verify if I couldn't play the piece, slowly, I couldn't possibly play it fast. Now, playing fast is different from playing slowly, but still, what I have seen, what I've learned is that you have to start at a level that you can play and verify that you can play it. And then, if you want to use a metronome, if you're patient enough to move up click by click, it's very effective. I was shocked when Jamie Buswell told me that. He was a great master, but that's how he worked. My friend Richard Good, who's one of the greatest pianists, he also practices diligently and carefully. I hope that was a reasonable answer.
How has your practicing evolved over the years, or even recently? Is there anything that has surprised you?
I think I became more intelligent as time went on. I think I wasted less time. I think, since I spoke about honesty, I think as time went by, I became more and more honest with myself. Because, all the things I've talked about, I was as liable as anybody else to make those errors. I became more calm in the way I practiced. I organized it better. I'm repeating myself. I listened better. I had problems with certain aspects of intonation. I improved them. I actually retrained. I'll tell you, for some reason, E flats and on the cello, on the C string, I always played them too low. I heard them too low. I trained myself. To play them better. Surprised? No, there have been no surprises. Every day is a bit of a surprise when you practice. You don't know exactly how things are going to turn out, and that's part of the mystery and the beauty of it for me. Recently, now that I forced myself. No, I invited myself to get up and play every piece I ever taught. The only major concerto I did not play in public was the Schumann. All the others I got up with an orchestra and I played them. Sometimes only once. And the truth is, I prepared very well, but sometimes one performance of a piece that hard isn't quite enough for you to find out what works, what doesn't work, and so on. All the sonatas I played, the chamber music, that was the key part of my life, piano trios, and earlier than that, string quartets. So now I'm not playing so much. In fact, I'm not playing at all. And I didn't say that with regret. It's time for people 40, 60 years younger than I am to do the same things, I hope with the same pleasure, that I've done. I practice less. I like taking it out every day, making it sound. And I have hundreds of pieces stored in my memory. I mean, for instance, this morning I played the cello solo from the Beethoven Septet, which is actually very difficult. One from the Schubert Octet. From all the quartets I played, all the piano trios, the symphonic repertoire. I'm always playing, I'm retrieving things from my memory that I feel like playing in that moment. But currently I'm actually not preparing a concert, so I don't practice as much as I once did.
Is there anything we haven't discussed that you feel is vital to productive, creative practice sessions? Or if there is one thing that you feel contributes the most to this?
Yes. You have to be gentle with yourself. It's hard. I mean, when I watched Lynn play, I thought, that's not hard. Well, you know what I found out? Lynn practiced more than I did. Lynn was a very diligent practicer. So it's very hard, it's very demanding, it's a cruel profession where everybody is making snide comments about everybody else. This one's good, this one's bad, I play better than this. It's a competitive profession. And you have to shield yourself from the kind of nastiness and competitiveness that is not uncommon. And in relation to, and be able to endure it, because it'll come. And then taking orchestra auditions. Sometimes you'll be successful, sometimes you won't. It's pretty crushing to prepare for weeks and months for an orchestra audition, and either you didn't play well, or you played well, but they hired somebody else. Okay, it's very hard. What I have been good at is being kind to myself and telling myself, I'm not doing this to prove that I'm better than anybody else. I'm doing this because this is something I love, and let's see how it turns out. And I have been demanding. Nobody could have made higher demands on myself than I did, but I have not been cruel. I said, Michael, you're terrible, you'll never learn to do this, no. And I think that the attitude that one takes toward oneself should be one of a stern set of demands that you know are required to ever learn to play well, but in a kindly disposition where you don't do anything to destroy your enthusiasm, your love for music, and your willingness to work. Actually, this is really important because I've seen many people. Actually, if I think back, I taught lots of gifted people, but some of them, for many of them, they were discouraged by how hard one actually has to work to really play. I have to tell you, I had many students who were more talented than I for the cello, but a good number of them would not do the work to acquire the full range of technique that they needed. I did do that work, and they did not go as far as I thought they were capable of. But I have to come back to the same point. I have seen a lot of cruelty in this profession, between musicians, between teachers and students, between conductors and orchestras. I hated all of it. I've tried not to participate in it. You have to defend yourself against it because you will encounter it, but it is in the relation to yourself, your goals, your love for music, your determination to go as far with it as you can. Don't let anybody crush that out of you, and don't crush it out of yourself either. I'm sorry, I have to say one more thing. When I began studying, everybody played better than I did. Many of them had been studied since they were children. I didn't let it affect me. I admired them. I went to this, that, and the other one. How do you do that? Can you help me? I wasn't going to compete with them. My life was not going to turn on whether I was better than him or better than her. But I could learn from them. And then my life has been an example of I just did what I did and I saw how it turned out. And I worked as hard as I could. But I realized my answer is too lengthy. Establish a stern set of demands in relation to your instrument, demands in relation to your practicing and how much and how well you will do it, but all in an environment of loving music and being kind and not destructive to yourself.
I think that marks the end of the questions. If you can give any closing remarks, that would be great, and I will let you know once the live broadcast has stopped.
Oh, I hope whoever watched and whoever will watch that there was something useful in this. And I think all I can say is I know many of you are beginning a new school year. Practice hard, enjoy your work, be kind to each other. Please make sure that you learn all the orchestra excerpts to the same level you learn your solo pieces. Not every teacher is willing to teach them. So if Boston, I know the principal cellist of the Boston Symphony teaches at NEC now. Find someone who is a master orchestra player who has learned those and learn them. Because when you ultimately take an orchestra audition, how many times have I heard the concerto was great, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony was not? Be sure that you don't leave that hole in your preparation, because playing in an orchestra, whether you stay for life or not, it's a great experience. You get to play some of the very best music, all the great symphonies and concertos, operas and ballets. Prepare yourself. The excerpts are difficult. Study with a teacher who enjoys teaching them and has learned them properly. And I wish you all an excellent school year.